Kel Glare is still one of Victoria's most respected police commissioners. Since his retirement, among many things that have kept him busy, he's also the chairman of the Community Advocacy Alliance. Now, Kel has also been a vocal supporter of ICook and the ICook Foods saga, and he's been speaking out about the criminality behind how the state government has behaved and its failure to properly investigate the matter, along with their failure to manage the protests. Now, Melbourne has endured even more protests over last month, and there's been some controversy surrounding the police behaviour and approach. Morning, Kel.
Hello, how are you going?
Good, thanks. Now, the iCook Foods saga, what got you on board with ICook's cause, Kel?
What a disgrace, what an absolute disgrace. An elderly woman died on the 4th of February 2019. 2 weeks later, on the 18th of February, after iCooks had provided something like 135,000 other meals, it was decided that they ought to be rated by the health inspectors and checked. Now, there was no evidence whatsoever that the unfortunate woman who died had consumed any foods from iCook. In fact, it was later found to the contrary that she hadn't consumed any food from iCooks. Nevertheless, the place was shut down. It was kept shut down for 2 weeks. It was absolutely unbelievable. A slug was planted. There were over 90 charges laid against Ian Cook and his company. When it got to court in October of that year, all the charges were withdrawn. After they came to Ian Cook and said, look, we've got a deal for you. If you plead guilty to 4 charges, we'll withdraw the rest. And he gave them a very direct message that he wouldn't be pleading guilty to anything because they hadn't done anything wrong, and all those charges were withdrawn. Now, they were trumped up charges in the first place. There was never any cause to close iCooks except maybe for the commercial advantage of a rival company, Community Chef, which was owned by 16 councils and which had lost something over $30 million over its 9-year-old lifespan, couldn't make a profit, and tried to force, and it had forced a couple of other businesses out of the business of supplying foods. So the whole thing was just a rort from start to finish and facilitated by people who really ought to have known better.
Now, Kel, we've followed Ian's horrific journey all the way along this. Now, these charges that were laid, they weren't just regulatory charges that could have seen him fined. He actually could have faced jail time from these charges, couldn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Ian Cook was certainly in line for jail had he been convicted of any number of those charges. They were very serious charges that were laid, but they were ill-conceived from the start. They were based on false evidence. I've seen personally evidence of that where I've seen a sworn statement made by one of the people who came from Dandenong Council to inspect iCook. And there are claims in that which are demonstrably false, and that's proven by video, in-house video. So it was perjury, pure and simple, and attempting to avert the course of justice. And you can go on from there. I mean, there's a whole host of charges like conspiracy and so on that could follow. Unfortunately, Victoria Police have been very slow to respond. They've had 2.5 years. A first-year constable looking at those sworn statements and the video could lay charges, but it hasn't happened. Now, I don't know whether it will. I hope it does. They need to get off their backsides and actually lay charges, because the evidence, and that's something I do know about, is evidence, having formed the Police Prosecutions Division and prosecuted professionally for a number of years, then there's something wrong if they can't see that there's a need to bring charges.
Yeah, it's not just a matter of Ian Cook's innocence, it's a matter of the guilt of the people who perpetrated this crime.
Oh, absolutely. Ian Cook and his business were totally innocent. They talked about listeria infection, and when they conducted tests on iCook Foods, they found that listeria, as you will in every food premises, but it was 10% of that which is allowed. So it was minuscule amount, and that's found in every business dealing with food. It's only when you get to those high levels that it's particularly dangerous. And so there was no basis for charges in the first place. And some of the charges were simply absurd. I mean, one charge was that there was water on the floor. Well, I've seen the video, and about 2 or 3 minutes before the inspectors arrive, there's one of the employees there with a mop and bucket mopping the floor. Of course there was water on the floor. They kept the place clean.
Now, as far as the motive goes, it's fairly clear that it was to help out community chef who was struggling at the time. But where does the instigation of this go, do you think? Whose feet does it lay at? Where did this scheme eventuate?
Well, it was the closure order was signed by Professor Brett Sutton. He either knew or ought to have known at the time that there was really no basis for it. I can't say that he definitely knew, but he ought to have known. Certainly his department knew. But the whole thing was a fiasco from start to finish, because when Jean Painter died, it should have led to an immediate investigation, because at Knox Private Hospital, where she was, had their own kitchen. They had a cafe downstairs where visitors used to bring food up to people who were there. There ought to have been a proper audit of what was consumed by whom, and particularly by Jean Painter. And that was never carried out. It was 2 weeks before any action was taken. And that was just a dereliction of duty, and the health department failed miserably in their responsibility in relation to that, and then exacerbated that by this fiasco that followed.
Now, the falsification of the evidence that ICook has documented and that you've seen, and as you said, it rises to the level of criminality. Who gets held responsible for this, and how does it get investigated? Kel, where does the next step go? How do we get this bumped up?
Well, there's a number of steps in process. ICook's suing civilly. He also has an action before the, can't think of the name of the body, just Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And fortunately, now a very eminent QC, Robert Richter, has agreed to take over the handling of that matter. Now, I've known Robert Richter for probably 45 years. He's a brilliant barrister. And I'm quite sure that he will represent the interests of iCook absolutely superbly. I would think there'd be a sphincter tightening factor in having someone like Robert Richter now acting on behalf of ICook Foods. If that doesn't focus the attention of those who have done the wrong thing, I don't know what will.
Now, yourself and there's another couple of retired detectives who are helping Ian, pro bono, that have just jumped on because of the magnitude of the wrongdoing here. Is what prompted you to get involved?
I was asked. Paul Brady and Rod Porter were the two detectives, former police skilled detectives, who put together 16 volumes of evidence and handed that over to police. It was a walk-up start for a police investigation, but Rod Porter contacted me and asked me whether I would have a look at the evidence and give them some assistance, which I readily agreed to do, because from what I'd heard up to that date, I was concerned that there was being a total miscarriage of justice, and ICook and his company were being unfairly treated. And when I had a look at what was happening and saw all the evidence, I was simply appalled. This shouldn't be allowed to happen in this state or anywhere in this country. We ought to have accountability and transparency in our public bodies. And when they exceed their powers and when they act corruptly, and I make no bones about saying corruptly, they must be brought to account. So as the chair of the Community Advocacy Alliance, we've been very hot on having government brought to account for a whole host of things. And we are not political. What we do is highly political, but we're not party political. If it was some other form of government in power, whether it was a coalition or the independents or whatever, and they behaved like this, we would be equally vocal. But of course, I'm sure the Labor Party sees us as very anti, as we are, because of the behaviour of this government, stemming right back to things like, the failure to build the East-West Link and wasting $1.2 billion, the red shirts rort, which in my mind, and I'm absolutely positive, was totally criminal. We've had ministers rorting their expenses, not brought to account. We had ministers chauffeuring his dogs round on the public purse. We've had a printing scandal. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And that's not the kind of government we need in Victoria. We need open, ethical, honest, accountable and competent government, and we're not getting it from this mob.
Now, glad we've segued into this, Kel. Now, a lot of the police are meant to be apolitical, a lot of the public service are meant to be apolitical, but they seem to be stacked now with government, Andrew's government acolytes that do their bidding. Is that what's leading to this?
They must be, but when we look at it, that simply can't be said. The public service is there to advise and implement government policy, and that's fine, but they really need to be also accountable for their actions, and that certainly hasn't been happening. I firmly believe that they've been told they'll toe the line or else, and not too many of them want to suffer the or else. So again, we've seen a politicisation of areas, including going back for the last 20 years of the police. That simply shouldn't occur. There's got to be a proper professional public service, and between the government and police, there's got to be a proper separation of powers. And unfortunately, over the last 20 years, that certainly hasn't been evident.
Now, I remember back in Mick Miller's day, the thought of him being bullied by the government just wasn't something that happened. You would be the same. And then it seemed to be, it started with Nick Comrie and his thing. I remember the Ashton pressure and him threatening to resign. And then after that, it just seemed the dam broke and the government was involved too heavily in the actions of the police.
When Neil Comrie took over, we were probably 2,000, I keep saying we, but the police force was probably 2,000 short in numbers at least. And he had a very difficult task, there's no question about that. And the force in the Cant, by the Cant government was literally decimated. I had 10,000 members. Neil Comrie lost 996 in the first 4 years. His problem was he kept saying that it's okay, we're working better, we're working smarter. It's not a problem. 2 weeks after he left the job, he said, I always knew it was a tremendous problem and we couldn't cope. Now, that did him no credit, because the simple fact of the matter was that he kept nodding and saying, yes, it's okay, when he well knew it wasn't. And then it got worse after that. I mean, we had Christine Nixon, we all know what a debacle that was in the bushfires, the Black Saturday bushfires. By law, she was a state coordinator, as I was when I was chief, and she went off and saw her biographer and got her hair done and went to dinner with friends when 177 people, I think it was, were being burnt to death. As a result of that, the coalition, when they were in power, formed a body to handle all disasters, disaster management. And that in itself probably wasn't a bad idea at the time, but the fact of the matter is that when we had the outbreak of corona and the pandemic, there's been a plan in place for 50 years for dealing with all kinds of disasters, including pandemics. Emergency Management Victoria, headed by Andrew Crisp, was the place to go for advice. But instead of that, the Premier and his gang of seven, as it have been named, decided that they knew better. And they put into the hotel quarantine area untrained security guards, not properly protected. They're allowed to mix with people who are infected and then go home to their families. And as a result of that, of course, coronavirus spread and we had 801 deaths. No one has been held accountable for those 801 deaths. And in my mind, again, it was criminal negligence that led to that. The security company that was involved was not properly accredited. They were bought in, no one quite knows why, because they are not on the list of preferred suppliers. And there are all kinds of questions being raised now about whether in fact they were legitimately licensed, because I have seen a document that said their license expired on a particular day without them making an application for extension. And then the following day, they applied and were granted a new license. Now, that's not how the legislation is written. They really needed to go back and make a complete reapplication with all the attendant paperwork. That didn't happen. That seems to be accused saying, oh, well, that was on a Sunday, it expired, and so it was on the next day of business, and that's all right. Well, I'm not too sure about that, but The fact of the matter is they weren't on the list of accredited suppliers, and one wonders why a 30 million contract was given to someone that really didn't seem to be eligible.
No, and especially if it was any other business, they'd be exposed to maybe industrial manslaughter laws for putting unqualified, untrained people into a position that has led to the death.
Yes, we have now just to make matters worse, we've now WorkSafe have decided to charge the health department with umpteen charges. Now, the fact of the matter is that departments don't make decisions. People in departments make decisions. So it's all very well to charge the health department. If they're convicted, they take an entry for whatever the fines are from one side of the ledger and put it on the other, and everything's sweet. No, it shouldn't work like that. The people who made the decisions must be held to be accountable for them. And there's just no accountability there. And so far as I'm concerned, it's a bad joke that we have a department charged, and yet all the people who made the decisions are running around with their heads in the air still getting well paid.
Yeah, but according to the Coates inquiry, no one's actually sure who actually signed the contract or who put them on.
Well, I've said many times that COVID's a very dangerous disease because it erases the memory of people who haven't even had it.
So,
if you would believe, or anyone would believe, that in fact these people can't remember who made the decisions, including who made the decision to pay a $30 million contract, you should come and see the fairies at the bottom of my garden. I mean, it just beggars belief that decisions of that nature could be forgotten and people can't recall. I mean, come on, that's fairyland. We had the Coates inquiry. Well, the Premier under pressure said, "Oh, I'll have an inquiry." So who chose the person to run it? Oh, that was the Premier. Who chose counsel assisting? Oh, well, that was the Premier again. Who instructed counsel assisting? Well, that was the government solicitor's office. Now, one would be excused for thinking there's a conflict of interest, that there ought to have been a separation there, but of course not. That's the last thing they wanted. And then, of course, we know there's the infamous failure of many memories when it got to the inquiry. The inquiry made a couple of useful findings, but the fact of the matter, it never got to the bottom of the issue at all. And it was set up to fail. The terms of reference were so restrictive that it was set up to fail. But we've got Teflon Dan who said, "Oh, we had an inquiry. We couldn't do more than that."
Yeah, and it also bought him some time where he could say, "There's an inquiry. I can't talk about it. I won't speak while the inquiry's on." So that gave him some cover as well.
Yeah, I mean, as a citizen, I just despair that we are seeing the kind of government that we have at the moment. They refuse to be accountable or anything. I see that I've just ordered to release a number of documents, and they've got 14 days in which to appeal that. I've got no doubt they'll appeal and obfuscate and delay and do their very best to keep all those documents out of public scrutiny. Now, governments should be open. They should be transparent. If they're representing the people, they shouldn't be ashamed to put forward, whatever they're doing. Everyone makes mistakes. Governments make mistakes. The idea is they should put up their hands and say, "Yes, look, we did this. We got it wrong. We'll do better next time." But they simply deny ever having made a mistake, which makes them, on a pedestal so far as ability to get it right every time is concerned. And no one now believes that, and their credibility, in my view, is shot to pieces. I expect that'll be reflected at the ballot box in due course, but there's a lot of morons out there who are rusted on to, one side of politics, and they really don't consider the issues that are involved. We've also, the Community Advocacy Alliance, we've started a recall petition. The idea is to introduce legislation, and this would take Parliament, introduce legislation so that if we have a poorly performing government who's corrupt, inept and unethical, we can force an election. Now that will require legislation, but on that petition at the moment, I think we've got something just short of 30,000 signatures. So we're not the only people out there who are concerned about what's been happening. And a recall petition was recently used in California. It didn't succeed against the incumbent there, but the fact of the matter is, if you have that legislation and governments, and it should apply to local government as well, know that they can be held to account if they don't perform, the very fact of the existence of that power tends to limit them from excess. So we ask everyone to go onto our CAA-INC website and sign that petition, because we get a groundswell of public opinion. We can, in fact, move mountains.
Now, back in your day, Kel, if COVID had appeared and the government came to you to enforce the orders that they're doing, and I think we spoke to the Police and Emergency Service Minister, Brad Batten. He said there's been over 32,000 infringement COVID notices issued in the last 18 months. And that's what he said, the oncoming manpower drain that will happen if they're contested in court, that will take police off the streets. What would have your approach been had the government asked you to take this approach?
I think that the only fines that should have been issued, frankly, were those for blatant, deliberate breaches. And police are between a rock and a hard place. They really don't get to choose which laws they'll enforce. But there's one thing that can never be taken away so far as police discretion is concerned, is whether they see an offence or not. It seems to me that all what's happened is that there's been a huge number of fines issued, very few have actually been paid, and it's alienated the Victoria Police from the community. And any police force that's alienated from the community can't be successful. So Chief Commissioner Shane Patton's got an enormous task ahead of him to re-establish some credibility for the Victoria Police. I notice, according to reports, that he's been negotiating with the government for some system to allow proper peaceful protest. Try and say that a number of times in a hurry. But I think that's a very good move on Chief Commissioner Patton's part, because there are some very genuine people out there. The vast majority of demonstrators are genuine. Whether you agree with their views or not isn't the point. They are genuine. And unfortunately, for all major demonstrations, there's always an element that turns up bent on causing violence, and that's why they come. They're not interested in the issues. All they want to do is attack police and create total disruption. The redder crowd like that turn up at every major demonstration, and that goes back in my day to the Vietnam War demonstrations, which were quite violent from so-called peaceful protesters. That's a bit sad that small element really ruins it for those people who are genuine. Whether you agree with their views or not, they're genuine.
Yep. Now, let's finish off with the iCook saga and Ian's plight. There were 42 people lost their jobs. A successful family-run business gone down the gurgler. Ian facing jail time. As you said, those 96 charges, I think it was, went away after they tried to negotiate, admit to this one, came back, no, we won't say yes to that, sign a non-disclosure, no, we won't say that. Ian has stood his ground staunchly and just really, really stood by the ethics of what is right. What should happen here? Where should the buck stop, do you think, Kel?
Well, there needs to be charges laid by Victoria Police. On the evidence, there's plenty of grounds for laying charges. But ultimately, I think it will need to end up in a Royal Commission to get to the bottom of just how far into government any of this reached. Now, the fact of the matter is that Community Chef never made a profit over the years it operated, except for maybe 1 year where they made a slight profit on the books. But it seems now they've been fiddling with their depreciation to limit the damage. But when something like $32 million of public money has ended up being expended for no apparent gain, then there needs to be inquiries to find out why. And now I understand that there's at least $800,000 that just seems to be missing in the books. There needs to be a proper financial audit to find out where the money went. And following the money trail might, in fact, be very enlightening as to why the business was so unsuccessful when iCooks was making a profit without the advantages of not paying payroll tax, for example, and other advantages. So I would prefer a quick judicial inquiry, an honest judicial inquiry, because you get an answer more quickly than a Royal Commission. But I don't think it's going to go away until such time as all of these issues are properly investigated and aired.
All right, Kel Glare, Victoria's former Police Chief Commissioner, thanks so much for your time.
It's my pleasure, anytime.